China and the U.S., one of the most important bilateral relations, has come a very long way. The interests of both sides have been largely integrated. As this year marks the 40th anniversary of diplomatic ties, and both sides have made substantive progress in the historical trade talks, what is to be expected for the relations between Beijing and Washington? How does the U.S. view its relations with a rising China? And what shall be done to narrow differences and enhance mutual trust? To discuss the many issues related to China-U.S. relations and more, I'm pleased to have Max Baucus, former U.S. ambassador to China, answer these questions from a recent interview. And we will also have Zhao Hai, research fellow from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, in the second half of our program. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
This year marks the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China relationship. First of all, do you believe this is still the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world?
I do. There's no question about it. The United States, the largest country, established power. China, rising power. Not too many years from now, GDP exceed that of the U.S. There's no question that it's most important, and because culturally each country is so different. It's not like the United States worrying about or thinking about Great Britain, culture, which is the same. No. In this case, it's China culture, very different. We must work well together to make this thing work.
Given the huge differences, political, cultural alike, since we're talking about the geopolitical rivalry, mistrust, more and more so on both sides across the Pacific, are we going back to the Cold War? Since there is a voice saying the United States would never go back to the relationship with China like what it was 40 years ago. No, even 5 years ago.
I think there's a lot to that. And it's very simple. It's because China's rising so much. China's so different from the United States. But that begs a deeper question, which is, what do we do about that? And we just have to work harder. Because it's more difficult, we have to work harder now to make this relationship work. It's going to take a lot of work.
What do you mean by working harder?
Well, we have to listen to each other more. And we also have to have the good faith to want to listen and to work with each other. On the U.S. side, for example, I'm just concerned there are many in the U.S. who think, well, maybe we should prevent China's rise. That's not good faith. That's bad faith. And I don't think China likes hearing that. It tends to cause problems. On the other hand, there's some in the U.S. who thinks that China is not opening up as fast. 40 years ago, Deng Xiaoping decided, well, let's open up China. And, China's opened up a lot, but it seems to some degree in America that Xi Jinping has slowed that down, slowed reform down a little bit, and that perception is not helpful.
40 years ago, in 1979, two major events took place that has somehow changed the world. One is, of course, the normalization of the bilateral ties between PRC and the United States. The other, the Islamic Revolution in Tehran. In the case of Iran, that country was closed for 4 decades, and with the latest reversal by President Trump of the Iran nuclear deal, it seems the Middle East faces more uncertainty, whilst China, ironically, faces the same issue of unpredictability, particularly during the presidency of Donald Trump. So what inspirations or lessons we should keep in mind in our review of what has happened during the past 4 decades?
The world's more complicated. It's becoming more insulated and isolated, each country, whether it's Mideast countries, Israel, Palestine, Iran, or even in Europe with Brexit, and in the United States with the America First policy, which is more inward-looking, not outward, and China is talking about its China dream. So you add it all together, countries tend to be looking more internally and pursuing more nationalistic trends than otherwise. And I think that's not good. We live this world together. we have to work well together. We trade a lot, goods, investment, back and forth. We have a lot of climate change interests. We've got other global health issues. And frankly, it's important for us to remember that people are basically the same the world over. Chinese people and American people have the same hopes and desires. What's that? They want to have decent income, want to have food on the table, want to take care of their kids, make sure their kids have a decent education, decent health, clean air and clean water. You know, people are the same. And it's just important for leaders to recognize that, leaders that represent their people to recognize that. I'm hoping that that'll encourage leaders then to think more about countries working together than trying to pursue their own personal, in many respects, aggrandizement kind of issues that support them as opposed to their people.
Policymakers across the aisle in the D.C. all want to redefine the U.S.-China relationship on their own terms. China is regarded as the most serious threat to your national security. But China says our rise would be more of an opportunity than a challenge because we are an important part of the global supply chain. Is it easy, for example, to decouple the Chinese economy from your perspective?
I think, frankly, it's wrong to talk about decoupling because that has very negative connotations. It sends a signal to the other side, whether it's America decoupling or China decoupling, that we don't want to work with you as much. It sends a signal that we're taking care of ourselves at your expense. And there are some reasons for people in each country to worry about their own national interests. That's true. Each country is different. On the other hand, with all the interconnections in the world today, especially trade and geopolitical, we got to work together. You know, for example, the tariffs that President Trump's imposed on Chinese products coming to the United States, 40% of that affects products that American companies use. So it's hurting we're hurting ourselves doing that. Having said that, I do appreciate President Trump's calling China out on not opening up as fast as it should, whether it's technology, forced technology transfer, IP, you name the issues. And there are a lot of American businessmen who feel that China mouths the words but doesn't do the deeds. It says, yeah, we'll do this, but sometimes China's pretty close. That was my experience when I was ambassador to China. I love the Chinese people. No one wants this relationship to work better than I. Nobody does. But the problem is that China sometimes says a lot but doesn't do it.
We need to walk the walk instead of talking the talk,
Correct.
Obviously. However, China is big in size. Uneven development would characterize our process of opening up and
right.
reform. Therefore, the agenda of the Chinese concerns would, of course, won't necessarily be on the same page with the United States. Having said this, President Xi and his predecessors all emphasized unanimously that we have been in the same boat. Do you agree? And you talked about the climate change and
right.
the proliferation of WMD,
right.
things like that would be things that would put the two countries together in addressing issues of common concern. Let's look at the positives instead of the negatives.
Right.
We have tons and tons of negative things that may threaten to tear apart the two countries. But what are the positive forces that may pull us together?
Well, I wish I could say climate change. Unfortunately, President Trump's withdrawn the United States from the Paris Accord. When I was serving over here, though, and President Xi and President Obama were really close together on climate change. That was a big area. Second was global health. President Obama and President Xi worked quite well on global health. Add to that North Korea. Our interests are pretty well aligned, United States and China, and North Korea. And for a long time I was on Iran, too, although President Trump withdrew from the Iran agreement. But there are many, many areas where the U.S. and China are working together, and it's very important that we keep working on those and build upon them, because that does help create momentum to deal with some of the more difficult problems.
What about the trust? Kenneth Lieberthal, a China hand that I know very well, and Professor Wang Jisi from Peking University agreed that the issue of mistrust threatens to get in the way, and therefore how to build trust remains the biggest concern for both sides.
Yeah.
Now, you were the ambassador to China during the Obama administration. What were the obstacles that need to be overcome to build trust?
Well, I think that T is the biggest T. It, if you'll pardon the expression, trumps the other T's. Because if there's trust, then we'll be able to deal with those other T's much more easily. The problem, frankly, is that our two countries are drifting apart a little bit. President Trump with America First is drifting away a bit from engaging China. President Xi is drifting a little bit with backing off a little bit on economic reform, it seems, and with cutting more repressions on civil society, a little bit social credit pursuits and things like that. So that makes things difficult. But that begs the question: what's the answer here? How do you get better trust? And it comes down to good faith. If President Trump really wants, in good faith, to develop a trusting relationship with China, then he can do it if he really wants to. But there's some political challenges he faces at home which tends to prevent him from doing that. Second, if President Xi really wants to have a very good, solid relationship with the United States, I know it's hard in China with all the different bureaucracies and all the different connections and companies and so forth, but if he really wants to, he can do more than he's done so far. They're leaders. They're covered by TV. They're covered by the media. If they really show if they want to work together and mean it, people will see that, and that'll help. That'll go a long way. I'd like to see, frankly, more BOAs. I'd like to see more instances where more top-flight American leaders and top businessmen come to BOA, for example. That helps. And Chinese go to Davos. Top Chinese businessmen, more of them go to Davos. They connect with each other, get to know each other, build relationships. All that helps. And also the other little exchanges we've had between the U.S. and China, maybe kind of on the surface don't amount to much. There's a lot of talk, not much action. But still, it's better than nothing. Because they keep working on it, keep working on it. It all comes down to good faith. You've got to want to build trust. And if you do, there's a better chance you will.
But Chinese leadership, since perhaps President Xi took office, says over and over that we respect the American leadership, we respect the current world order, and we just want to be part of the globalization, which, however, in the terms of President Trump, does more harm to the American national states and interests. We are talking about the globalization. So how could we move forward in this context?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. For example, with President Xi recently in Italy with the Belt and Road Initiative, I think that's fine. That's great. China wants to build a relationship with Italy, fine. If Italy wants to take Chinese investment, that's fine. It may upset some Europeans. It may upset Americans. That's okay. Frankly, they're doing the whole thing. They can take care of themselves. And so it just means that we have to understand that each country has its own interest. China is China. The U.S. is U.S. Americans can't tell China what to do. Chinese can't tell America what to do. We got to just deal with each other on equal terms, respecting each other, and not in a condescending way, but in an equal way. And the more we do that, the more that tends to help.
Welcome back. We are happy to be joined in the second half by Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He's an expert of U.S. studies. Welcome to our discussion here, Dr. Zhao.
Thank you.
What do you make of Ambassador Barker's comments on President Xi's recent visit to Europe?
I think his idea is quite different from the mainstream Washington, D.C.'s idea on President Xi's visit to Europe, because he said it's okay that China cooperate with Italy for Italy to join the BRI project, and also China to get closer in terms of cooperation with European countries. However, recently, before Italy joined BRI, actually the U.S. National Security Council Twitter account came out and pressured Italy twice. And there are a lot of people in Washington criticized Italy as a G7 member and also as a critical EU member joining the BRI without consulting, for instance, with the EU or the United States. So I think in that respect, he distanced himself from some of the people, hawkish faction in Washington, D.C. that don't understand the meaning and the significance of China's spreading of BRI.
What do you think of Ambassador Barker's comments on looking at each other on equal terms instead of lecturing each other?
I think Ambassador Balkis really represented a more rational, more moderate wing of American politics towards China. There are people who for instance, Steve Bannon recently talked about how 5G, AI, and other high tech combined, China wanted to dominate those areas and trying to displace the U.S. as a dominant power. And I think those kind of conspiracy theory really is harmful to U.S.-China relations. Unlike those people, I think Ambassador Balkis represented people who are saying that we can cooperate in those areas, and those security concerns can be managed. I think that's why a lot of European countries came out and say, we can manage these risks and we can do research independently without U.S. interference.
But elsewhere, let's move our eyes from continental Europe to the Taiwan Strait, which is said to be the most dangerous flashpoint in the U.S.-China relationship. Recently, American fleet crossed the strait quite a few times to sort of provocatively showcase the muscles of the U.S. Pentagon. I mean, what do you think should be the likely response from the Chinese PLA? I mean, mil-to-mil ties used to be regarded as the barometer of the most consequential relationship. This time around, what we should guard against is the spillover of the bad relationship from trade imbalance to security areas. Do you think what happens in the Taiwan Strait may deliver an early warning that something bad could happen easily?
Indeed, I think the Taiwan Strait is the most dangerous area in which U.S. and China can go into conflict, direct confrontation. I think that's also related to the issue where Ambassador Balkis talked about trust. On the Taiwan issue, there's less trust between U.S. and China, and the U.S. side interpreted China's defense of its sovereignty as an aggressive act against Taiwan. So they wanted to push back by, for instance, sailing its warships through the Taiwan Strait. In that respect, I think China needs to stand its ground and inform the U.S. that the military option is only to defend China's sovereignty. It's not a provocative act against the U.S. or Taiwanese people. It's just to defend, to protect, and to prevent any possibility that the Taiwan pro-independent people get the wrong idea from the U.S.
The United States says that it will protect the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. But basically, observers, Chinese and American alike, would say, we don't have a very substantial mechanism for dialogue between the two militaries, except for perhaps the Shangri-La dialogue, which is an annual event in Singapore. Do we have a hotline to make sure that nothing serious would spin out of control in an emergency case like the South China Sea, despite the possibility that we're going to adopt the COC, Code of Conduct?
Well, I think there is a mechanism in place, and both sides is trying to build a direct red line between the two sides and trying to pick up the phone when there's an incident happening in South China Sea. However, the problem is, in many ways, when the U.S. is having provocative actions, particularly increasing its rate of visiting South China Sea with its FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea. It's very hard for China to comply with those interactions with the U.S. and conduct normal military-to-military cooperations. And if you remember, the United States actually disinvited China from its Pacific military drills, and it's a very, I think, in that terms, bad faith activity against China. So I think it's for the U.S. to take the first step to reestablish that kind of trust between U.S. and China, so that we can move forward with more constructive mechanism in terms of talking about South China Sea.
An editorial, in fact, it's a message that Mr. Hu Xijin, editor-in-chief of Global Times, posted on the social media of Weibo, which says some fighter jets crossed the central line in Taiwan Strait to deliver a clear message to authorities in Taiwan and perhaps those in the Pentagon that sailing American warships through the Taiwan Strait provocatively won't remain, as quiet as the water that runs so deep. It means the PLA is determined to safeguard the sovereignty of a united China. What do you think of the mil-to-mil ties in the foreseeable future?
Well, I think at present it's going to be strained. There are a couple of reasons. One is what you have mentioned. There are provocative actions taken by the U.S. military in Taiwan Strait, also South China Sea. The other is that the leadership in Pentagon is still not certain. We have an acting Secretary of Defense there, and there's no people in charge to make policy. Before him, current acting Secretary Shanahan, actually Secretary Mattis has worked in good faith and interacted with China in a number of occasions. And I think both sides established that meal-to-meal relations should be improved. We're still waiting for the signal from the U.S. side that they're willing to improve relations other than other issues like trade.
Given the plane crash in Ethiopia and the strong Boeing background of Secretary Shanahan, what do you think of this man's future? Will he be the leader of the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, despite the negative impact of this disaster, the Boeing MAX 800?
Yeah. Perhaps that's going to affect his political career, but that's U.S. domestic politics. We don't want to interfere. But whoever in the position will be in the position of Secretary of Defense in the future. We, of course, wish that China and U.S. improve its meal-to-meal relationship in the future by establishing more trust mechanism and also have more interactions, particularly in terms of global governance. As Ambassador Baucus mentioned, we have a lot of areas for cooperation in terms of climate change, global health, and also humanitarian aid. So I think in many of those areas, both China and U.S., the two biggest and most advanced army in the world, should work hand in hand together to guard the global governance.
Trade and economic relations used to be the most important stabilizing force in the U.S.-China relationship. What do you think of the outcome of the trade negotiations between the two sides? Do you think trade will continue to balance this most consequential relationship?
Well, I believe trade relations between the two sides is still the ballast of this very important bilateral relationship. It's going to continue to be so because we're so interconnected during the globalization period, and it's very hard to so-called decouple the two economies. I think the recent signal from the market clearly indicate that if we reach a new deal between U.S. and China, it's going to be very beneficial for both countries and the world. So I think that's a very positive sign, particularly a number coming from the U.S. and also China and also European countries, because now there are a lot of new signals that other countries are falling into recession or close to recession. It needs more trade globally and better economic interactions. So I think it's going to be very positive if we can reach a deal as soon as possible. But I think both sides, the working team, are working very hard to establish that.
Dr. Zhao, this year, 2019, is the 40th anniversary of the U.S.-China relationship, and it's also the 70th anniversary of our founding of the PRC back in 1949. It seems that there is a consensus across the aisle in the D.C. between Democrats and Republicans about China relations and China policy. However, do you think we have also built a consensus between the government, elites, and ordinary folks in China regarding the future of this relationship?
I think, yeah, in China we have. We wanted to establish a more constructive, cooperative, steady strategic relationship with the United States. I think on the U.S. side, there is probably a general sense that moving forward, U.S.-China relationship will be a long-term strategic competitive relationship. However, I think there are different factions in the U.S. Concerning how to make policy, concrete policy, towards China. There are still differences. From the Chinese perspective, I think we need to cooperate in those areas that I mentioned. Also, Ambassador Baucus mentioned that we can cooperate. And in economic areas, in high-tech, for instance, we can definitely compete in a peaceful way based on rule-based international rules to compete with each other without spilling over into other areas and turn that into confrontational relationship.
Given the quiet but apparent changes in power equation between the rising power and the sitting power, what should be done to build trust? Trust seems to be a luxury between the two countries. However, these two countries are the two biggest economies.
Well, first of all, China has already showed it wants to want the U.S. trust. For instance, just the day before, China actually enlisted 25 fentanyl products into its banned drug index, and that showed a good faith from the Chinese side that President Xi promised to President Trump that we will do that, and we actually achieved that. That sent a very clear signal to the U.S. side that once we have a trade deal, the Chinese side will execute it faithfully. Same thing, I think, if you look at the long run between U.S. and China, even though there are some delays and maybe the speed is not satisfactory to the U.S. side, but China has continued to make progress in terms of integrating into the global system and meeting the standard of WTO. So I think the U.S. needs to reduce its anxiety and actually deal with China with more confidence and more good faith.
As there is a growing noise in the United Kingdom about having a no-deal Brexit, President Trump wants to see a good deal. Without a good deal, most serious consequences are likely to take place. So what do you think of the importance of soybeans, the recent reduction of tariffs on auto spare parts, and energy supply is also badly needed by the biggest and most dynamic market in China. Look at these things. Do you think we have good reasons to show cautious optimism instead of sharing a kind of a gloomy sentiment with the liberals here in China? And when you always look at the remarks of Steve Bannon, you're going to have a very different feeling, right?
Yeah. I continue to have a relatively optimistic outlook of U.S.-China relationship because not only for the past 40 years we established diplomatic relations. However, if you look at the past 200 years, when the U.S. established as a young country, started trading with China very early on. And for the past 200 years, we continued to trade with each other. And even though there's up and downs of relationship between the two sides, but the trend is continue to go upward. And now we have a very close trade, investment, people-to-people exchange relationship, and it's hard to break up. So I think in order to, for instance, in the future, to establish more trust between the two sides, it's very important, it's critical not to impede people-to-people exchanges, and instead to improve that exchanges so that people will have better understanding of each other. Because Ambassador Bolk has mentioned that we're two very different cultures. Without interaction, how do you understand each other's position and each other's culture and to build a peaceful and constructive relationship? So I think the U.S. side needs to reconsider some of its stringent policies limiting, for instance, overseas students from China to the U.S. or other relationships, not only in terms of good trades, but also services.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao. Trust could only be built on better mutual understanding through more and more people-to-people exchanges. There are currently 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, and more young Chinese and their parents have good reasons to show their grave concerns about the future of academic research and the construction of soft power. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue with Dr. Zhao Hai and Ambassador Max Baucus, former U.S. Ambassador to China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.